Beneath the velvet crowns and polished portraits, behind the rigid posture and royal wave, there were bodies, tired, twisted, broken, bleeding. For centuries, the British monarchy mastered the art of appearances, while quietly hiding everything that didn't fit. From secret diagnoses to vanishing heirs, this is the story of 33 royals whose imperfections were airbrushed out of history. Some were hidden, some erased. All were inconvenient. Tonight, we peel back the silk and gold to ask a simple question. What happens when the people born to rule are betrayed by their own flesh? Before we dive in, if you're drawn to the strange, the hidden, and the stories history tried to forget, hit that subscribe button. This channel is where royalty loses its mask. And while you're here, drop a comment below. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now as you're hearing this? Let's see who else is awake for a little royal disillusionment. 1. Prince John. If you blinked, you missed him. Prince John, youngest child of King George V and Queen Mary, was born in 1905, the fifth son of a monarch obsessed with duty, and the sixth child of a queen obsessed with appearances. In the beginning, he was a royal like any other, christened with pomp, photographed in sailor suits, and expected to recite Latin verbs on command. But something quietly wasn't right. At first they said he was simply slow, a little off, a little distracted, not quite keeping up with his sharp siblings. Then the seizures began. Violent, unpredictable, and unwelcome in the Edwardian royal mythos of masculine control and constitutional poise. Doctors diagnosed him with epilepsy, though the specifics were rarely mentioned. In fact, most of his life wouldn't be mentioned at all. As his condition worsened, Prince John began to disappear. His public appearances stopped entirely around the age of 11. His name was gradually omitted from palace conversations, his portrait increasingly absent from family photographs. By 1917, he was moved permanently to Wood Farm, a modest house on the Sandringham estate, along with his nurse and a small entourage, mostly groundskeepers and medical staff. That's where he stayed. Out of sight, out of frame, out of mind. Even his siblings barely saw him. Queen Mary visited occasionally, but even her affection was described as clinical. King George V didn't attend his son's funeral in 1919 when John died suddenly from a major seizure. The official explanation? It was too painful. But for a monarch who had once said, "I was frightened of my father, and my children are frightened of me," the more likely explanation was silence itself. Painful things were simply not discussed, especially if they made the House of Windsor look weak. What's strange is how tidy the disappearance was. There was no scandal, no press leak, no grand cover-up. Just a child removed from public life so efficiently that even now, some royal historians struggle to describe his final years in more than a few vague paragraphs. Prince John, in essence, became a negative space, defined by his absence, his removal, his gradual erasure from the myth of regal perfection. For decades, many assumed it was shame that drove this concealment, a family hiding a flaw. But the deeper tragedy may be something colder: indifference. Prince John wasn't hidden because of the stigma of disability. He was hidden because he couldn't be useful, couldn't perform, couldn't represent. And in a monarchy that defines itself by image, he became expendable. After his death, Queen Mary wrote in her diary that it was a great relief. And it probably was. Not because she didn't love him, but because now the contradiction was gone. The dissonance between royal ideal and human reality had been, conveniently, resolved. The child vanished, and the illusion remained intact. But that illusion, once cracked, never quite reseals. Because if the system could forget Prince John, its own blood, what else could it choose not to see? What other secrets are not just buried, but preemptively erased? Consider this. Prince John wasn't the only royal hidden from view. Just a few decades later, in a different wing of the family tree, two more royal women would be written out of the story entirely. not deceased, but alive, and institutionalized. 2. Nerissa Bowe's Lion. The story of Nerissa Bowe's lion begins like a family footnote and ends like a national metaphor. She was born in 1919, the same year Prince John died, almost as if the royal bloodline, still uneasy with imperfection, decided to reroute its quiet tragedies somewhere else. Nerissa was the niece of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, making her first cousin to Queen Elizabeth II. And from birth, she was both royal and invisible. Her early years barely exist in record. The few family documents that mention her describe her as backward, the period's polite shorthand for someone who didn't fit the mold of society, or the monarchy. Nerissa, along with her younger sister Catherine, was born with significant developmental disabilities. In an age obsessed with heredity, decorum, and the optics of good breeding, this was not merely a private difficulty, it was a reputational crisis. By the 1940s, both sisters had disappeared from family gatherings, omitted from correspondence, and, most tellingly, listed as deceased in Burke's Peerage, the genealogical Bible of British nobility. Officially dead. In reality, they were very much alive, confined to the Royal Earlswood Hospital in Surrey. Institutionalized for life. The secrecy wasn't a brief embarrassment or a bureaucratic accident. It was systemic. The Bowe's Lion sisters lived in the hospital for decades, surrounded by staff who had no idea their patients were cousins to the Queen. Their family never visited. Nurses later described them as sweet, affectionate, and capable of joy within the limits of their world. But no royal ever walked through the door to see them. Even their mother, Fenella Bowe's Lion, is said to have visited only once. The hospital records simply list their long days and longer silences. When Nerissa died in 1986, she was buried in a modest grave marked only by a plastic tag and a number. No stone, no name. Just another patient in a long institutional ledger. It wasn't until journalists uncovered the story in 1987 that the public learned the truth. The Queen's cousins had been hidden in plain sight, their existence erased to preserve the family's pristine image of moral and genetic superiority. The revelations caused outrage, of course, but the monarchy's response was characteristically sterile. A few lines of official regret, a suggestion that standards of care were different then, and silence resumed. But beneath that bureaucratic calm was an unmistakable pattern. Just as Prince John had been quietly removed for being inconveniently human, Nerissa and Catherine were written out for being inconveniently alive. The monarchy, it seemed, did not hide its weak, it deleted them. Yet Nerissa's story isn't only about cruelty, it's about inheritance. Because she and Catherine were descended from the same line that produced King George III, whose bouts of mental illness would later define an entire cultural myth, the Mad King. Historians now debate whether the family's secrecy was motivated by fear of stigma or fear of exposure, perhaps both. After all, if the royal bloodline could carry madness, frailty, or imperfection, what did that mean for divine right, for legitimacy, for the illusion of chosen perfection on which the crown depends? Nerissa's grave now bears a small proper headstone. It was added after the media uproar. It stands as an apology, perhaps, but also as a reminder that apologies rarely undo erasure. You can add a name to a stone, but you can't return a life to history once it's been edited out. And that's the real unease here. The monarchy didn't simply lose track of a cousin. It rehearsed the art of concealment. It learned how to remove what didn't fit. Because while Nerissa and Catherine were hidden away behind institutional walls, other heirs, healthier ones, would inherit the gilded stage and carry on pretending the walls didn't exist. Which brings us neatly to Catherine herself, the younger sister who shared Nerissa's silence, her exile, and the strange burden of being born royal but treated as if she had never existed at all. And if you're still here, curled up in the quiet with these unsettling royal footnotes, don't forget to subscribe. we unravel the stories history preferred to bury. While you're listening, tell me in the comments, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it right now in your corner of the world? Let's see who else is wandering through forgotten corridors this late. 3. Catherine Bowes Lyon. Catherine's life reads like the echo of a footnote stretched into a lifetime. Born into the same family that would one day supply a reigning queen, Catherine Bowes Lyon shared blood with the center of Britain's public stage. And somehow, she never got a line. Where the monarchy paraded pageantry, she received paperwork. Where portraits captured smiles, she received invoices from a hospital. The contrast between kinship and care is the quiet cruelty of her story. She was younger than Nerissa, a sister in the literal sense, and in fate. Where Nerissa was born in 1919, Catherine arrived in 1926, and for a brief moment the family narrative could have included her as a cousin at christenings, as a face at weddings, as a presence in family letters. Instead, Catherine, like Nerissa, was described in the genteel jargon of the time: backward, feeble-minded, language that did more to sanitize dignity than to describe a human being. Those labels, wielded by doctors and ennobled relatives, became permission to remove. Institutionalization was the era's solution. It served the household and the public image simultaneously. It cared for those who couldn't be cared for at home, and it kept the inconvenient private. Catherine was placed for many years in Earlswood Hospital, a sprawling institution designed to be comprehensive and, paradoxically, to render life homogeneous. The hospital's regime was propriety with a schedule: therapies, meals, routines, small satisfactions, and a large, steady absence of the family's intimacy. To call Catherine's existence a life of shame would be to miss the subtler injury: obliteration. She was not merely kept out of sight. She was actively edited out of the genealogies that mattered. Burke's peerage, the aristocratic ledger, listed both sisters as dead. The record, more authority than truth, made it so. This bureaucratic erasure was not accidental. It was functionary. It read like a policy choice disguised as clerical error. If the family's line could be cleansed of perceived imperfections on paper, maybe the public myth would remain untarnished. And yet, though the institution took her name, it did not quite take her personhood. Nurses remembered Catherine as gentle, placid, capable of laughter in small moments, responsive to music, soothed by sunlight through institutional windows. She stitched, maybe. She hummed, perhaps. These were not heroic acts. They were the private ordinariness of a life lived without headlines. The staff who cared for her, overworked, underpaid, humane, saw a woman who deserved visits and letters and the occasional hand-squeezed greeting. Those things were not part of the royal script, apparently. When Nerissa's grave and the story of the Bowes Lyon cousins leaked into public view in the late 1980s, the revelation felt like a stain on a laundering too thorough to be true. The royal household offered perfunctory sympathy, and the media devoured the scandalized moral. How could a family so public counsel secrecy around its own? But scandal is a short-lived currency. The sting faded, the headlines moved on, and the sisters remained, for many readers, a cautionary tale about the monarchy's cost of appearing impeccable. Catherine died in 2014. In a society that had changed enormously since her baby days, her death passed in quieter ink. Yet the fact that she lived to 88, longer than many of her glamorous cousins, complicates the narrative of erasure. It means she had seasons, decades, an arc of days, however constrained. It means the hospital, for all its institutional nature, cradled an extended life that outlived the original intent to simply make the problem disappear. Here's the sting. For centuries, monarchy depended on myth, lineage uninterrupted, visage unblemished, and narrative tidy. Catherine's life exposed the seams. She wasn't a footnote. She was evidence that the script needed an editor. The editors erred by assuming that removing a name erased the human traces that memory and record stubbornly kept. Even a ledger's silence is noisy if you listen for the people behind the columns. The Bowes-Lyons sisters' hidden existence is a historical fault line. It divides eras of concealment from an era of disclosure. And that shift, public revelation over private erasure, will become crucial in the decades that follow. Because later in the century, the monarchy will face a different kind of challenge. Not only how to hide, but whether to reveal. The next figure on our list will embody that transition. An emblem of the modern royal who chooses confession over concealment, surgery over secrecy, and who, in telling, changes what it means to be a royal with a body that does not conform to expectation. 4. Princess Eugenie. In a monarchy obsessed with posture, both literal and symbolic, Princess Eugenie's spine became a quiet rebellion. Born in 1990, the younger daughter of Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson, she arrived into a royal family already straining under the weight of its public image. Her existence came with expectations: grace, duty, discretion, posture. But by age 11, her spine had other plans. The diagnosis was scoliosis, a condition where the spine twists and curves sideways, sometimes subtly, sometimes drastically. In Eugenie's case, it wasn't a minor cosmetic quirk. Her curvature was pronounced enough to demand surgery. Metal rods were inserted along her spine. Screws anchored them in place. It was major, invasive, and largely hidden from the public at the time. Unlike Prince John or the Bowes-Lyons sisters, Eugenie was not institutionalized or erased. But the instinct toward concealment, so deeply baked into royal DNA, still hummed in the background. For years, the full extent of her condition was simply unmentioned. The public saw her at royal events, smiling and composed, wearing tailored dresses that hid the surgical scar snaking down her back. The monarchy is a theater of symmetry. A royal's spine, quite literally, is expected to hold up the crown. And yet here was a young princess, walking through her teenage years, with a scaffolding of metal silently bracing her body beneath the surface. What's curious is not that she had the condition, but when and how she chose to reveal it. In 2018, Eugenie did something rare for a Windsor. She invited vulnerability into the spotlight. For her wedding to Jack Brooksbank, she wore a custom Peter Pilotto gown with a dramatic open back, not for style, but for symbolism. The dress revealed her spinal scar in full view. There was no press leak, no shameful whisper, no strategic distraction. She showed it, deliberately, quietly, proudly. The move felt almost radical, not because scars are rare, everyone has them, but because royalty isn't supposed to. Royals are supposed to glide, to gleam, to appear unbothered by the human truths of flesh and bone. Eugenie's scar cracked that illusion, not with fanfare or defiance, but with quiet grace. She reframed the story. Her scar wasn't a flaw. It was part of her strength. It wasn't hidden. It was chosen. Of course, there were magazine spreads, interviews, Instagram posts, and advocacy work to follow. She became a patron of scoliosis charities, spoke at events, encouraged other young people facing similar surgeries. It was modern, media-savvy, and perhaps even brand-reinforcing. But beneath the PR tone lay something older and more resonant, a subtle challenge to the monarchy's historical discomfort with physical difference. Because for centuries, any deviation from the ideal royal body had to be hidden: stammers, curvatures, seizures, scars. Eugenie's openness wasn't just a personal choice, it was a generational pivot. She wasn't edited out of the story. She rewrote her part. The body that would once have been confined, concealed, or denied became the centerpiece of a very public ritual. A royal wedding, with the scar front and center, a literal line drawn across history. Still, it would be naive to think this marks a complete transformation. Eugenie is not in line for the throne. Her presence is symbolic, not structural. The crown can afford to be vulnerable through her in a way it cannot through its heirs. But even as a footnote, She's a pointed one, an asterisk next to centuries of perfectionist myth-making. And myths, once punctured, tend to ripple outward. Because if a princess can show her spine, metal and all, what does that mean for the many others who were told, quietly and persistently, that there was no room for the body to bend? That question leads us back in time, to another royal who couldn't afford to show weakness. Not because he didn't want to, but because his blood carried something far more dangerous than curvature. Something that flowed invisibly, lethally, and with every chance injury. Hemophilia. 5. Prince Leopold, Duke of Albany. There's something bitterly ironic about being born into unimaginable wealth and still being undone by your blood. Prince Leopold, the 8th child and youngest son of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, was born in 1853 into what was arguably the most medically curious royal household in European history. The family line boasted dozens of children, cross-continental marriages, and just enough inbreeding to make the textbooks uneasy. And within all of that, Leopold was the first confirmed royal hemophiliac, a diagnosis that would shape not just his life, but the fate of an entire dynasty. Hemophilia is a genetic disorder that prevents blood from clotting properly. To the average Victorian observer, it wasn't immediately visible. There were no deformities, no limps, no obvious signs of frailty. But if Leopold fell, or even bruised too hard, the consequences could be quietly catastrophic. As a child, he was labeled delicate. The euphemism was both accurate and insufficient. His life became a choreography of caution. No roughhousing, no horseback riding, no military service. The things that defined masculinity and royal image in the 19th century were denied to him, not out of cruelty but out of sheer medical necessity. Queen Victoria, for all her emotional steel, was reportedly fiercely protective of Leopold. He was her favorite in that peculiar way monarchs sometimes favor the weakest, because their fragility mirrors something unspoken in themselves. She appointed him unofficial family librarian, made sure he had tutors, even granted him a ducal title so he'd have standing independent of martial glory. He became the Duke of Albany at 21. A royal with a title, a mind for philosophy, and a body wrapped in metaphorical glass. But the danger was constant. His health challenges weren't completely hidden. Court insiders knew of his condition, but the details were softened in public narratives. Terms like delicate constitution and poor health were used instead of anything that suggested vulnerability at the molecular level. To the public, he was the Queen's clever, slightly sickly son. To the palace, he was a logistical headache. Travel had to be planned. Doctors were always nearby. And when he married Princess Helena of Waldeck and Pyrmont in 1882, it was both a personal achievement and a dynastic gamble. The couple had 2 children, one of whom, Princess Alice, carried the hemophilia gene forward into the next generation, ensuring its persistence. Leopold died in 1884 at the age of 30 after a minor fall led to internal bleeding. Even in death, his story felt more like a whispered caution than a tragedy. Official accounts focused on his sudden passing. Only in later biographies did the full pattern become clear. This was no isolated case. Hemophilia had entered the royal bloodstream, and through Victoria's descendants, it would travel across Europe, into the Spanish, German, and Russian royal lines, quietly destabilizing dynasties from within. So why does Leopold matter, beyond the medical textbook? Because he was the first breach. The first time the public fantasy of royal invincibility was challenged by a body that refused to cooperate. And instead of reshaping the narrative, the institution chose a more familiar solution: euphemism, soft language, and the polite fading of detail. But the body doesn't care about euphemism. Neither do genes. Which brings us to a royal whose body would be endlessly mythologized, distorted, and immortalized. Part medical fact, part political propaganda. A man whose spine would be studied more than his reign. Richard III, The king, the skeleton, the question mark. 6. Richard III. Few royal bodies have been argued over with as much fervor and forensic precision as Richard III's. King of England from 1483 to 1485, he ruled for just 2 years, died in a ditch, was buried in a church, paved over by a parking lot, and eventually exhumed by archaeologists armed with DNA kits and historical grudges. His story has become a centuries-long tug-of-war between legend and anatomy, between villainy and vertebrae. According to the Tudor-friendly version of history, popularized by Shakespeare and polished by propaganda, Richard III was not only a murderous usurper, but also a hunchbacked embodiment of evil, crooked in body, crooked in soul. That was the logic. Physical deformity was proof of moral defect, and the Tudors, having wrested the throne from him, were only too happy to let the image stand. But the truth, as ever, is more complicated and more unsettling. In 2012, Richard's skeleton was discovered beneath a municipal parking lot in Leicester, exactly where an old monastic record said it would be. The remains showed clear signs of scoliosis, a pronounced curvature of the spine. Not the monstrous hunch of Tudor imagination, but a real and significant spinal condition nonetheless. He would have stood shorter than his armor suggested. He may have tilted to one side. His shoulders likely sat unevenly, but he was no grotesque. And yet, that slight curvature had been turned into caricature for centuries. Why? Because deformity, however mild, has always been a convenient metaphor. In Richard's case, it was a political one. When the Tudors rose to power after the Battle of Bosworth, they needed to discredit the man they had just defeated. Painting him as physically deformed wasn't just smear, it was strategy. If his back was bent, surely so was his claim to the throne. If his body was twisted, so too was his soul. It's an old trick. Conflate outer appearance with inner worth. And the monarchy, for all its obsession with bloodlines, has always had a parallel obsession with visual perfection. Regal bearing, royal posture. Richard's scoliosis complicated that. So the facts were bent further than his spine ever was, until the fiction replaced the flesh. Even in death, Richard couldn't escape scrutiny. His skeleton became public property. Facial reconstructions, spine simulations, debates about whether he needed custom armor. Medical records centuries too late, reconstructed by curiosity and conjecture. Ironically, the man who died in obscurity has now been examined more thoroughly than most living royals. But here's the twist. The rediscovery of Richard's spine didn't exonerate him. It only made the moral question more ambiguous. If he wasn't as deformed as the Tudors claimed, does that make him less of a villain? Or just a more palatable one? And that ambiguity matters, because it shows how royal bodies are never just bodies. They're vessels for narrative, propaganda, and projection. Richard's scoliosis became a weapon, then a myth, then a case study. Not because he had a curved spine, but because it was useful to pretend he was bent out of shape, body and soul alike. But what happens when a royal struggle isn't mythologized, but managed behind closed doors? What if the deformity is mild, the condition chronic, and the response meticulously staged? For that, we move forward to a king whose jaw clenched every time he spoke in public, whose sentences came haltingly, and whose war was with words themselves. George VI. 7. George VI. George VI never expected to be king, and frankly, neither did anyone else. Born the second son of George V in 1895, Albert, known to family as Bertie, was raised in the comforting shadow of the throne. He was trained for service, for ceremony, for a dignified life just outside the spotlight. But when his older brother, Edward VIII, abdicated in 1936 to marry a divorced American socialite, that spotlight turned, sharply and irrevocably, on to Bertie. Unfortunately, Bertie had a problem. He couldn't speak. Or rather, he couldn't speak fluently in public without immense effort. George VI was a lifelong stammerer, not a mild theatrical pause, but a deep, unpredictable, physically agonizing blockage of speech that, for a man raised in the emotionally buttoned-up machinery of the British monarchy, was a daily source of shame and private torment. The public knew something was off. His speeches were shorter, his delivery strained. But what they didn't see, or weren't meant to see, was the brutal preparation behind the curtain. Speech therapy sessions, breathing exercises, vocal drills, private rehearsals that stretched into the night, and always the undercurrent of embarrassment, a monarch whose tongue betrayed him every time he needed to appear unshakable. The condition wasn't named aloud by the palace, of course. In that era, medical privacy was indistinguishable from institutional denial. Royal discomforts were transformed into noble eccentricities or quietly ignored. The idea that a king, an emperor no less, could falter mid-sentence was too discordant for the image of imperial composure. So George's stammer was managed, disguised, softened. His speeches were edited for rhythm, rewritten for ease. When recordings were made, they were done in pieces, stitched together. The finished product was presented with polish. The struggle it masked was not part of the broadcast, but that struggle defined his reign more than anyone could have predicted. George VI became king in the lead-up to World War II, and suddenly, his voice, his literal, physical voice, became a national symbol. The king who couldn't speak would now have to rally an empire. And somehow, he did. Not perfectly, not fluidly, but with visible effort, audible strain, and, eventually, an air of reluctant dignity. Every halting syllable became a paradox. Weakness turned strength, vulnerability made regal. And perhaps that's why the public connected with him so deeply. Because his imperfection was inescapable, and yet he persisted. Of course, there was more than just the stammer. George VI also suffered from leg problems in childhood, possibly knock knees, requiring braces and physical therapy. These early struggles were largely hidden from public view, folded into the narrative of a sickly second son who eventually found his footing. But the truth is messier. The monarchy didn't overcome his challenges, it smoothed them over. His story became, conveniently, one of personal triumph. A stammering prince becomes a steady king, a symbol of wartime resolve. But what made that narrative resonate wasn't the arc. It was the visible tension. Every time he stood at a podium, the country leaned forward, willing the words to come out. When they did, however imperfectly, it felt real in a way the monarchy rarely allows. Still, George VI's public vulnerability was only possible because the conditions were manageable, the flaws reframable. The stammer could be recast as courage. But what if the imperfection couldn't be rebranded? What if it couldn't be edited, hidden, or spun? For that, we looked to his brother, less famous, less successful, and quietly struggling with a set of physical challenges that no amount of wartime rhetoric could elevate. Prince Henry, the Duke of Gloucester. 8. Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester. Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester, was a royal largely forgotten, not because he scandalized the monarchy, but because he never quite fit the frame. Born in 1900, the third son of King George V and Queen Mary, he lived most of his life behind his more glamorous brothers. Never meant to rule, never quite prepared to shine. In the family's grand public tableau, Henry was background. Duty-bound, quiet, mildly awkward. But behind that dim royal lighting was a man whose body seemed to constantly resist the role he was born into. From childhood, Henry struggled with physical development. Historical records describe him as having knock knees, a condition where the legs angle inward, causing the knees to touch while the ankles remain apart. It may sound benign by modern standards, easily treatable with braces or physical therapy, but in the image-conscious Edwardian royal world, it was a visual liability. The monarchy has always equated physical symmetry with moral authority. And young Henry, stiff-legged and often unsteady, disrupted that aesthetic. To correct the condition, he was reportedly fitted with leg braces, clunky, uncomfortable, and designed more for long-term alignment than short-term dignity. There are few photographs from this period, and none where the braces are visible. The visual record has been pruned, as royal archives often are, leaving only polite mentions of health concerns and growing pains. But in private, Henry's physical challenges followed him into adolescence. He was awkward in movement, less confident than his brothers, and often outshone in both public ceremony and private expectation. He also reportedly struggled with speech. Not a stammer like George VI, but difficulties with articulation that required coaching and adaptation. His public speaking engagements were limited, and when they did occur, they were carefully stage-managed. Unlike his brother Bertie, Henry's discomfort with the spotlight was not dramatized into a heroic narrative. Instead, it was quietly sidelined, filed under supporting royal. As an adult, Henry found some footing in military service, though even there his physicality was a factor. He served with loyalty, if not particular distinction. His role became one of ceremonial utility, opening hospitals, attending garden parties, standing in for the crown where glamour was not required. His imperfections were not denied, but they were never discussed. He was kept on the edges of the royal frame, just useful enough to justify inclusion. And yet, in many ways, Henry embodied the burden of monarchy better than his more celebrated relatives. He bore the expectations without the spotlight, the imperfections without the myth. His body, uncooperative, unideal, quietly managed, was the kind the royal machine doesn't quite know what to do with. Not tragic enough to rewrite, not exemplary enough to showcase. But this kind of physical fragility wasn't new to the royal line. In fact, it echoed back centuries, to a queen whose body broke down while her power only grew. A monarch carried through palaces, swollen and limping, while the weight of a collapsing dynasty pressed against her aching frame. Queen Anne. 9. Queen Anne. Queen Anne reigned, just barely. Not for lack of authority. She ruled over the Union of England and Scotland and oversaw a defining chapter in British political history, but because her body made ruling a physically agonizing ordeal. Born in 1665, Anne became queen in 1702, and from her earliest years, she was plagued by a slow-burning war between her royal obligations and the relentless betrayals of her own health. Anne suffered from a slew of chronic ailments: gout, dropsy, a term then used for severe swelling, recurring fevers, and painfully swollen joints. In her final years, she was so infirm she had to be carried between rooms in a specially designed sedan chair. Some portraits hint at her condition: extra layers of fabric, carefully posed hands, or simply paintings made from memory rather than real sittings. But the image of Queen Anne the public was allowed to see never quite reflected the reality of Queen Anne the woman. Contemporaries were not always discreet. Courtiers described her as bloated, lethargic, unable to stand for long periods. Political enemies called her lazy, ruled by favorites, or simply unfit. But the truth was that Anne tried, again and again, to rise above a body that seemed to conspire against her. She gave birth to at least 17 children, most of whom died in infancy or early childhood. The emotional toll of that repeated loss cannot be overstated, nor can its political consequences. Without a surviving heir, Anne's reign was shadowed by succession anxiety. Her personal pain became national instability. And yet, she governed. She attended cabinet meetings from her upholstered chair, signed papers with trembling hands, and dictated state business while enduring chronic physical suffering. Her health was rarely mentioned in official statements, and the public was offered the usual substitute: quiet omissions, delayed appearances, and the ever-useful veil of royal mystery. There's something deeply paradoxical about Anne's reign. She wielded immense power, yet her mobility was limited. She was declared the symbol of a newly united kingdom, even as her own body was fragmenting. Power was hers, But performance, public presence, confident speech, robust ceremony was often beyond her reach. Still, the monarchy endured, and so did she, for 12 tumultuous years. But the irony of Queen Anne is that her body, so publicly cloaked in velvet and symbolism, ultimately dictated the future of the crown. Her lack of surviving heirs ended the Stuart line and paved the way for the Hanoverians. Fragility, once again, reshaped dynastic history, not through scandal or rebellion, but through biology. And it wouldn't be the last time, because the next royal in line would face physical challenges of a different kind, less visible, more subtle, but equally disruptive. A future king whose earliest steps were hesitant, whose legs defied early childhood expectations, and whose strength would forever seem slightly borrowed. Charles I. 10. Charles I. Before he lost his head, Charles I lost his footing, literally. Born in 1600 as the second son of King James VI of Scotland, later James I of England, Charles was never expected to reign. That duty belonged to his elder brother, Henry Frederick, Prince of Wales. But when Henry died suddenly in 1612, the quiet, sickly younger son became the heir. And that's where the trouble began, not just politically, but physically. From infancy, Charles was notably weak. He didn't walk until he was around 3, well beyond the usual developmental milestone. Contemporary reports described him as frail, undersized, and hesitant. His ankles were especially problematic, so unsteady that he was initially carried around on a pillow by attendants. Whether it was a form of rickets, a neurological issue, or simple early motor delay remains unclear. Medical records from the era are vague at best and speculative at worst. But the consensus is that Charles had difficulty moving with the confidence expected of a royal child. In a court culture obsessed with poise and elegance, especially under the extravagantly theatrical reign of James I, this was a problem. Nobility was performed, and Charles couldn't perform it properly. He struggled with balance, with articulation, and with presence. His gait was awkward, his speech somewhat impaired in early years, and he developed a pronounced stammer that followed him into adulthood. The royal family responded predictably. They downplayed, corrected, and compensated. Charles was given the best tutors and physical therapies available, including what we might now call early intervention training. He learned to ride, fence, and dance, though always with slightly more effort than grace. As he matured, he grew into a solemn, dignified man, if not a naturally charismatic one. He cultivated a sense of royal gravity that leaned more on divine right than personal charm. By adulthood, most of his childhood impairments had softened into quirks. But those early years left an imprint. Charles was deeply self-conscious, fiercely committed to formality, and obsessed with the image of kingship. To compensate for physical vulnerability, he leaned hard into the doctrine of absolute monarchy. His belief in royal authority was not just political, it was existential. His body may have failed him, but his throne, he believed, would not. Of course it did. His reign ended in civil war, trial, and execution. The man who had once stumbled through palace corridors was marched to a scaffold in 1649, met not by applause or pity, but by the cold mechanics of political consequence. Yet the frailty of Charles I, the hesitant child turned rigid monarch, set the tone for a lineage of royals who confused physical imperfection with moral weakness, and moral weakness with threats to order. And that legacy would echo through the very next generation. Because his son, too, would inherit not just a throne, but a body marked by childhood, difficulty, though this time the instability wasn't in the limbs but somewhere deeper, in the brain, in the bones, and in the constant physical reminders that no crown can fully protect its wearer. Enter James I's other royal legacy, his grandson, James VI and I. 11. James VI and I. Before he was King of England, before he ruled over both crowns of Britain in an uneasy union, James VI of Scotland, later James I of England, was a sickly child in a dangerous world. Born in 1566 to Mary, Queen of Scots, and her ill-fated husband, Lord Darnley, James came into the world amid political turmoil and personal instability. His father was murdered before James was 1 year old, his mother was imprisoned and eventually executed, and he was raised not by parents but by regents and advisors who handled him like a fragile diplomatic document. And in many ways, James was fragile. His early years were marked by a range of physical problems that would stay with him for life. His legs were weak, so weak, in fact, that some sources claim he had to be carried until the age of 6. He walked with a pronounced limp. He was clumsy, prone to falls, and often mocked for his awkward gait. Courtiers described him as waddling, shuffling, or lurching from side to side, an image that didn't quite align with the poised silhouette expected of a monarch. Modern historians have speculated that James may have suffered from a mild form of cerebral palsy or childhood rickets, but no diagnosis can be confirmed with the records available. What we do know is that his physical condition shaped the perception of his authority from the very beginning. In a world where royal strength was measured in horseback riding, swordsmanship, and effortless public display, James's physical inelegance stood out. His mannerisms were exaggerated, his posture was uneven, and his appearance, short, thick-set, and always slightly unbalanced, invited ridicule from enemies and embarrassment from allies. He attempted to compensate with intellect and verbosity. James was brilliant, no question, deeply learned, fluent in multiple languages, and an obsessive writer. He published works on theology, kingship, and even the dangers of witchcraft. But his physical bearing rarely matched his intellectual gravity. Foreign ambassadors noted his restless twitching, his tendency to drool, his poorly timed gestures. He was simultaneously king and court jester, depending on the room and the observer. Despite his condition, James ruled for decades, first as King of Scots and then as King of England and Ireland. He fathered multiple children, unified the crowns, survived assassination plots, and left behind a complex legacy, equal parts political maneuvering and theological obsession. But even in success, he couldn't quite escape the physical caricature that clung to him. To many, he remained the king with unsteady legs, unable to project the easy grace expected of a sovereign. His reign marked a shift. The throne could now be occupied by someone whose authority came from intellect rather than posture. And yet, the whisper of physical deficiency never fully faded. In portraits, James is stiff, often seated, his robes carefully arranged. The monarchy had learned how to frame the imperfect body by not letting it move. But others were not so easily posed, because while James at least ruled, others at court were reduced to objects of scrutiny, examined, whispered about, and quietly managed. None more so than a man who wielded immense political power, yet walked with a crooked spine, Robert Cecil. 12. Robert Cecil, 1st Earl of Salisbury. Robert Cecil was never meant to be seen. Not in the full light of the court, at least, not where symmetry and spectacle reigned, and certainly not where a man's back could betray him before his words ever did. As the son of William Cecil, chief advisor to Queen Elizabeth I, Robert was born into power. But unlike his towering father, Robert entered public life at a visual disadvantage. He was small, hunched, and walked with a pronounced spinal curvature, what most contemporaries called a crookback. In a royal court obsessed with form, his form was all anyone seemed to notice. His condition, likely scoliosis or kyphosis, was never named in medical terms by the men who mocked him, only painted in metaphor. His enemies, both political and poetic, compared him to a goblin, a spider, a toad. Ben Jonson described him as the little man, others as the elf. His disability wasn't just a fact, it was political currency. His crooked spine became shorthand for crooked motives. In the iconography of the court, a deformed body hinted at a deformed soul. But Robert Cecil wasn't just a courtier. He was the architect of empire. Behind the ridicule was a formidable strategist. He served Elizabeth I with tireless precision and later became the principal advisor to James I, orchestrating one of the most complex successions in English history. He managed the transition between the Tudor and Stuart dynasties with surgical tact, preventing what could have been a civil war. It was Cecil, with his stooped back and sharp mind, who deciphered the gunpowder plot in 1605 and coordinated the prosecution that followed. And yet, no matter how powerful he became, his body remained a public liability. Portraits of him are stiff, formal, and oddly cautious, as though the artist was afraid to let the truth of his form into the frame. Courtly gossip framed his posture as evidence of corruption, his appearance as unnatural. He was a man whose intelligence could be admired, but never comfortably mythologized. Too bent to fit the mold of the perfect statesman, too clever to ignore. Cecil's story reveals a deeper truth about the court of early modern England. That deformity and disability were never neutral. They were politicized, weaponized, or erased. A crooked back was not just a back, it was a flaw in the body politic. And the more visible the deviation, the more fiercely the monarchy and its orbit sought to translate it into character. But what happens when the body that falters isn't male and can't be caricatured with toadish metaphors? What happens when the flaw is not in posture, but in skin, in teeth, in the slow erosion of royal beauty? Enter Elizabeth I, Cecil's queen, who fought her physical decline with powders, pearls, and a public image as carefully constructed as a battlefield. 13. Elizabeth I. For a monarch whose authority depended so heavily on spectacle, Elizabeth I spent the final decades of her reign waging a slow, private war against her body. Known to history as the Virgin Queen, Gloriana, the Fairy Queen, Elizabeth was more than a ruler. She was an image, a projection of national strength, celestial grace, and impervious beauty. But under the powdered mask and carefully arranged jewels, her body was changing, failing even, and the crown required that none of it be seen. Elizabeth had survived smallpox in 1562, a disease that spared her life but left her skin marked and fragile. In an age where scarring was equated with disfigurement, and disfigurement with moral or spiritual defect, this posed a problem. Her face, once the canvas of youth and courtly poetry, became something to be managed. Corrected with thick layers of Venetian ceruse, a lead-based cosmetic paste that smoothed and brightened the skin while slowly poisoning it. The irony was cruel. The very substance meant to preserve her image hastened its decay. Her teeth, too, became an object of anxiety. Contemporary observers noted their discoloration and eventual loss, likely due to sugar consumption, infection, or both. She became reluctant to speak in public and rarely smiled openly in her later years. Foreign ambassadors remarked, often unkindly, on the gap between the myth and the woman. But within England, the myth held, because Elizabeth controlled the camera before there were cameras. She dictated how and when she was seen. She banned unflattering portraits, authorized only idealized images, and ensured that her physical decline remained as absent from public consciousness as possible. Behind palace walls, her wardrobe became armor. Wigs concealed thinning hair. Dresses with exaggerated silhouettes and stiff ruffs drew the eye away from aging hands and a hunched back. She became her own optical illusion. In her final years, courtiers described her as increasingly melancholic, sleepless, and in chronic pain. But the performance continued. She insisted on standing during long audiences. She resisted taking to her bed even when her strength began to vanish. Power, to Elizabeth, was inseparable from display. And it worked until it didn't. In her final days, she reportedly refused to allow herself to be undressed or put to bed, as though lying down would be an admission that the myth had ended. When she died in 1603, after 44 years on the throne, She left behind a kingdom stronger than it had been, but a body carefully written out of its own story. Elizabeth's physical decline was never acknowledged during her reign. That silence wasn't accidental, it was strategy. Her image had to be eternal, even if her body was not. But the cracks in the facade mattered, because after Elizabeth, the myth of divine perfection began to wobble. The body of the monarch, once untouchable, was now visibly human. And if the Virgin Queen could be eroded by time and poison and silence, what did that mean for a king who visibly fell apart in public, whose very legs were plagued by ulcers and whose image of might had to be propped up with layers of fabric, flattery, and denial? That king was Henry VIII. 14. Henry VIII. By the end of his life, Henry VIII was as much an invention as he was a man. Layer upon layer of myth, embroidered robes, political theater, and denial. A towering figure in British history, both literally and symbolically, Henry is remembered as the embodiment of regal strength, fierce will, and dynastic ambition. But beneath that carefully cultivated persona, painted with exaggerated shoulders and commanding stares, was a man slowly undone by his own body. Born in 1491, Henry began life with the kind of physical advantages that made him the ideal Renaissance prince. Tall, athletic, handsome, and skilled in jousting, hunting, and dancing, he projected an image of health and virility that the Tudor court eagerly embraced. He was the opposite of his cautious father, Henry VII. Where the old king was lean and measured, Henry VIII was bold, brawny, and built for spectacle. For a while. Then came the injuries, and then the denial. A serious jousting accident in 1536 left Henry with a leg wound that never properly healed. Over time, it became ulcerated, painful, persistent, and prone to infection. His mobility declined. He grew increasingly sedentary, his once celebrated figure thickening into something closer to immobility. Later portraits show the change. The confident young man with narrow hips becomes a swollen king supported by layers of regal fabric and artistic flattery. The eyes are still sharp, but the body is increasingly immobilized. The court, of course, said little. Publicly, Henry remained the majestic head of church and state, the divine right king whose authority came not only from bloodline, but from strength. The art was complicit. Hans Holbein and other court painters elevated the king's image to near-divine levels, omitting crutches, cushions, or the entourage of attendants required to help him move. But privately, it was a different story. The leg ulcers were a constant source of agony. He struggled with infections, likely suffered from metabolic issues, and became increasingly irritable and volatile. His clothing had to be adjusted regularly as his size increased. He could no longer mount a horse. Long council meetings had to be shortened, and though he continued to command authority, much of it was now performed from a chair. Yet the myth endured. Because in Tudor England, power had no room for decline. Kings did not limp. Kings did not struggle to stand. Kings did not, above all, suffer visibly. And so Henry's physical deterioration was treated as an unfortunate rumor, not a fact. An inconvenience, not a reality. Still, that reality had consequences. His mood soured. His decisions grew more erratic. His court navigated not only his policies but his pain, and his image, massive, powerful, unquestioned, hid a slow unraveling that no amount of royal robes could fully conceal. But what happens when physical fragility isn't masked in oil paintings or concealed behind velvet curtains? What if the suffering is quieter, chronic, and managed behind the smoke of royal routine? For that, we look to his son, George V, whose lungs whispered a different kind of weakness into the machinery of monarchy. 15. George V was not a king given to flourish. Stiff, reserved, and famously fond of uniforms, he reigned from 1910 to 1936, with the demeanor of a man constantly preparing for a formal inspection. He didn't command attention like Henry VIII, nor radiate mystique like Elizabeth I. He simply endured, through war, constitutional crises, and the shifting sands of a collapsing empire. And yet, behind that stoic exterior was a body that steadily betrayed him, breath by breath. Born in 1865, George was the second son of Edward VII and never intended to be king. But the death of his elder brother, Prince Albert Victor, pushed him into the line of succession. From his naval youth to his long reign, George carried himself with martial discipline, tightly wound, dutiful, allergic to display. His public persona was orderly to the point of severity. But internally, his health was far more chaotic. He was a lifelong smoker, fiercely habitual, and by the time he was in his 50s, it was taking a visible toll. George suffered from chronic bronchitis, a condition worsened by the cold English climate and made near fatal by decades of nicotine. Photographs from the 1920s show a man growing noticeably thinner, with sunken features and a perpetually pinched expression. His breath grew labored, his energy waned, and his doctors, led by the famous Lord Dawson of Penn, managed his condition in quiet desperation. Official bulletins downplayed the seriousness. Terms like indisposed or under the weather were employed in place of anything resembling clinical honesty. This was, after all, the British monarchy. Symptoms were managed not only with medicine, but with euphemism. Appearances mattered more than diagnoses. During the final years of his reign, George's health declined steadily. He spent increasing time at Bognor Regis, then a seaside town believed to offer healing sea air, where he recovered from serious episodes of bronchial infection and pleurisy. His breathing was weak, his strength inconsistent. Public events were missed, then reduced, then canceled entirely. But the image of royal composure persisted. He remained, as much as possible, upright in his suffering. The end, when it came, was quietly unsettling. George V died in 1936, and only decades later was it revealed that his death had been hastened by his own physician. An injection of morphine and cocaine administered not for pain, but for timing. The monarchy wanted the king's death announced in the morning papers, not in the evening tabloids. Even in death, image management prevailed. George's illness wasn't scandalous. It was slow, dignified, and carefully veiled. But it set a precedent for the 20th century monarchy: conceal the chronic, manage decline behind the scenes, present strength until the very last breath. But not all ailments stay hidden, and not all royals were content to let weakness be framed as absence. Some would live with invisible struggles that the monarchy could no longer fully contain, like Princess Alice of Battenberg, a royal who heard no music but claimed to hear God. 16. Princess Alice of Battenberg. Before she was the mother of Prince Philip and grandmother to a future king, Princess Alice of Battenberg was a child born into silence, quite literally. Born in 1885 at Windsor Castle, Alice came into the world as a great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria, a princess of both Britain and Germany, and someone who would spend most of her life either misunderstood or politely set aside. From an early age, it was clear that Alice was different. She didn't respond when people called her name. She seemed withdrawn, unfocused. The truth was much simpler, and more easily ignored. She was almost completely deaf. Her mother, Princess Victoria of Hesse, believed she had a mental slowness, but in reality, Alice was sharp, intelligent, and observant. She simply couldn't hear the world around her. Eventually, her deafness was acknowledged, grudgingly, and she was taught to lip-read in multiple languages. This adaptation gave her the appearance of normalcy, and in royal settings, appearance was often enough. She married Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark, and for a time, played the role of royal wife with diplomatic ease. But the strain of 2 world wars, repeated displacement, and the collapse of the Greek monarchy slowly pulled at her already fragile equilibrium. In the 1930s, Alice underwent what many historians now describe as a psychological collapse. She experienced religious visions, claimed divine communication, and withdrew from her family. Diagnosed at the time with paranoid schizophrenia, she was forcibly institutionalized in Switzerland, against her will and with little ceremony. Her husband left. Her children were scattered. Her mother wrote her off as a tragic case, but Alice's story didn't end in silence. After years of isolation, she emerged, transformed not into the brittle invalid her doctors expected, but into something far stranger and stronger. She became deeply devout, founded a nursing order of Greek Orthodox nuns, and returned to Greece during the Nazi occupation, where she sheltered a Jewish family in her own home. When questioned by the Gestapo, she reportedly played up her deafness to avoid interrogation. She wore a nun's habit in her later years and refused luxury, despite her royal blood. When she moved to Buckingham Palace in her final years, invited by her son, Prince Philip, she brought with her no possessions of note, only her faith and a reputation that had shifted from embarrassment to quiet reverence. But her silence, first imposed, then chosen, says something about how the monarchy handles what it can't explain. Deafness was ignored. Spiritual visions were medicalized. A woman too strange for ceremony was gently exiled from the stage. And yet, behind that veil of religious devotion and personal eccentricity lies a question that monarchies often dodge. What happens when a royal doesn't fit the script? Because sometimes the body doesn't scream or stumble. Sometimes it suffers in subtler ways, like through blinding headaches, chronic fatigue, and whispers of a strange inherited disease that might have haunted a queen. Mary, Queen of Scots. 17. Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary, Queen of Scots, was a monarch defined by spectacle, her beauty, her tragedies, her 3 husbands, her execution. But beneath the political dramas and romantic mythology lies a quieter, more elusive narrative, a body that may have been fighting its own invisible war. Mary was born in 1542 and spent much of her early life in France, a queen in training groomed for Catholic royalty. She was elegant, tall for her time, and famously charismatic. Foreign ambassadors wrote admiringly of her poise, her languages, her ability to command a room. But by her 20s, signs of unexplained physical distress began to surface. Recurrent migraines, nausea, weakness, and sensitivity to light. At various points in her letters, she complained of unbearable headaches, of needing to stay in darkness, of being too sick to leave her bed. These weren't isolated incidents. They occurred regularly. Long, debilitating bouts that seemed to interfere with her ability to govern, negotiate, or even appear in court. In a monarchy built on presence and projection, illness meant absence, and absence meant vulnerability. Yet these episodes were rarely discussed by her advisors in detail. They were brushed aside as female ailments, emotional sensitivity, or stress, coded language for something inconvenient and not easily fixed. Modern historians and medical researchers have speculated that Mary may have suffered from porphyria, a rare genetic disorder that affects the nervous system and often causes photosensitivity, abdominal pain, and, in some cases, mental disturbances. It's a theory more rooted in possibility than proof, but it gains traction when viewed across her family line. Porphyria has been suggested in multiple royal figures descended from or related to Mary, most notably King George III. The symptoms, irregular attacks, light sensitivity, episodic pain, seem to track. What's telling, though, is not just the potential diagnosis, but the silence around it. Mary's physical struggles were folded into a narrative of emotional instability, volatile behavior, and political miscalculation. She was a queen undone by passion, not by pain, or so the story goes. Yet what if her failures weren't solely strategic or romantic? What if they were also physical? What if, in a cold, damp Scottish castle, under the pressures of political betrayal and public scrutiny, her own body became another battlefield, one she couldn't win? Mary's health never recovered fully after her imprisonment. By the time she was executed in 1587, her legend had eclipsed her reality. But legends don't feel pain. Her body did. And in the legacy of royal history, that pain, mute, cyclical, largely undocumented, remains a whisper behind the headlines. Whispers like these often get written off as coincidence or gossip. But when they repeat across generations and bloodlines, they begin to sound more like warnings. Just ask those who chronicled the skin of a king and the seizures of a monarch mistaken for a leper, Henry IV. 18. Henry IV. Henry IV of England was many things. A usurper, a crusader, a political survivor. But beneath the crown and chainmail, his body told a more vulnerable story. One that, like so many royal tales, was buried beneath euphemism, ritual, and medieval medicine. Born in 1367, Henry Bolingbroke seized the throne from his cousin Richard II in 1399 and spent the next decade defending that decision with sword, statute, and spectacle. Yet, in the shadows of his reign, his body was slowly betraying him. By the mid-1400s, Henry was experiencing a series of unexplained and increasingly debilitating symptoms. Chronic fatigue, periodic collapse, facial lesions, swelling. At times, he was unable to travel, unable to preside over court, and, most unsettlingly for a king, unable to appear in public for weeks or months at a time. Eyewitnesses described him as stricken, sore, and tormented. The medieval chroniclers did what they always did when a king's body failed. They wrapped the truth in rumor and metaphor. Some said he had leprosy. Others whispered about divine punishment or curses. A few even claimed he was touched by madness. In truth, the condition remains undiagnosed to this day, but many historians believe he suffered from a chronic skin disease, perhaps psoriasis or a severe form of eczema, complicated by repeated infections and cardiovascular issues. One modern theory is that he experienced intermittent strokes. Another suggests porphyria. But in the 15th century, the most compelling diagnosis was simply unclean. That label mattered. Kings were supposed to reflect divine order, not only in law but in flesh. A visibly diseased monarch was more than a medical problem. He was a crisis of symbolism. That's why Henry's condition had to be hidden, managed, or reinterpreted through the lens of penance. His illness was not treated, but moralized. He became more pious in his later years, retreating from public life, devoting himself to religious rituals. Whether this was spiritual reckoning or physical necessity, no one could say. But the image of the king changed. Once a bold warrior on horseback, Henry IV became a spectral presence, whispered about, glimpsed, and eventually mourned. What makes his story haunting is not the illness itself, but how the court processed it. Not with curiosity or care, but with silence and distance. Royal power depended on strength, and when strength faltered, visibility had to go with it. But not all fading health could be moralized into sainthood. The next monarch, Richard II, ironically the cousin Henry deposed, would leave behind a very different kind of mystery, a reign that slid from poetry into paranoia with just enough odd behavior to suggest something deeper was wrong. Not with his body this time, but perhaps with his mind. 19. Richard III. Richard II's life was a paradox, wrapped in pageantry. A king raised to believe he was chosen by God, yet undone by human fragility. Born in 1367, he inherited the throne as a boy after the death of his grandfather, Edward III, and the early passing of his father, the celebrated Black Prince. From the beginning, Richard's kingship was theatrical, ceremonial, and precarious. His rule was less about ruling and more about being seen, about the divine optics of monarchy. But somewhere behind that ritualized radiance, something quietly fractured. The chroniclers of the time struggled to describe him. Some called him sensitive, others capricious. Still others hinted at a growing instability. He wept easily, raged unexpectedly, and obsessed over personal loyalty with an intensity that unnerved his court. His decisions could swing from magnanimous to vindictive without warning. He was a king of mood and moment, a temperament ill-suited to the slow, grinding politics of medieval governance. By his 20s, Richard's behavior had become unpredictable enough to invite whispers. He withdrew from advisors, issued erratic decrees, and imposed harsh punishments for perceived slights. He dressed with excessive extravagance, collected relics obsessively, and was rumored to converse with saints and statues. In an era before the language of psychology, such behavior was labeled as vanity or tyranny. But modern historians have quietly suggested that Richard's patterns might point toward a form of mental illness, perhaps bipolar disorder or a neuropsychiatric condition worsened by isolation, stress, and trauma. There were physical symptoms too, though faintly recorded. Fainting spells, insomnia, unexplained fatigue. He complained of suffocation in the chest and black melancholy, phrases that, in medieval medical vocabulary, often stood in for depression or anxiety. But in the 14th century, a king could not be ill in the mind without being ill in the body of state, and so his mental decline became a political one. By 1399, his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, soon to be Henry IV, took advantage of that fragility. When Richard was captured and deposed, he reportedly fell into a deep, silent despondency, refusing food and counsel. His final months, spent imprisoned in Pontefract Castle, are recorded in fragments. Some say he was starved, others that he refused sustenance. Either way, the narrative ended in erasure, one more royal life rewritten to preserve stability. Richard's story is unsettling, not just because of how he fell, but because of how quickly his human complexity was repackaged as divine failure. His volatility became sin, his sadness, weakness. History turned him into a cautionary tale, not a case study. And yet, his reign planted a strange seed, a recognition, however subconscious, that kings might be mentally breakable, that the divine right of rule could coexist with a mortal mind on the edge of collapse. That idea would not die with Richard. It would echo centuries later in the haunted brilliance of another young monarch whose face never healed properly after battle and whose scar became both shield and myth. The next royal in our hidden chronicle, Henry V. 20. Edward VI. Edward VI is often remembered as the sickly boy king who reigned briefly between two towering Tudor queens, his father's heir and his sister's prelude. Born in 1537 to Henry VIII and Jane Seymour, he arrived as a miracle of dynastic hope, a male Tudor successor in a world obsessed with male legitimacy. But from the beginning, Edward's body never quite lived up to the weight of the crown it was meant to carry. Much of what we know about Edward's health comes secondhand, filtered through Tudor chroniclers, ambassadorial reports, and court gossip, none of which are particularly interested in the boy beneath the regalia. Yet even within these carefully staged documents, the signs are hard to miss. He was often described as frail, pallid, or delicate. He tired easily. His bones were slim, his appetite inconsistent. While not obviously deformed, Edward seems to have suffered from persistent, low-grade ailments that left him vulnerable to the very things a king could not afford: weakness, fatigue, and prolonged absence from the public stage. Some modern historians have examined Tudor portraits of Edward and noted what appears to be a slight asymmetry in his shoulders, possibly suggesting scoliosis or postural imbalance. But in an age where portraiture was more aspiration than documentation, it's hard to say whether these hints were anatomical truths or artistic oversight. What we do know is that by his early teens, Edward's health was visibly declining. His complexion worsened. His coughing increased. His presence at court functions diminished. And then, in early 1553, just months before his death, he essentially vanished from public view. The official cause of death was consumption, the period term for tuberculosis. But some scholars have questioned whether that diagnosis tells the whole story. His final weeks were marked by a dramatic wasting of the body, with reports of skin discoloration, labored breathing, and near-total physical collapse. Yet even then, the palace tried to keep the extent of his illness quiet. A dying king in his mid-teens didn't suit the image of strength the Tudor regime needed to project, and so, behind the palace gates, Edward withered in near secrecy. But beyond the physical decline, there's something eerie about Edward's short reign. He was a boy who ruled in name, while adults fought wars of religion, politics, and succession in his stead. His body may have been king, but it was also a vessel, an emblem of Protestant hope, used and idealized, even as it weakened. When he died at just 15, the regime scrambled to install Lady Jane Grey, bypassing his Catholic sister Mary. Even in death, Edward's legacy was a battleground. But the silence around his health, around the visible decline of a teenage monarch, set a precedent. The crown, once again, proved more durable than the body beneath it. And if Edward's subtle frailty was masked in caution and courtly restraint, the next royal in line was quite the opposite. A warrior king whose wounds were visible, whose face bore the mark of battle, and whose crown sat uneasily atop a war-shaped head. That king was Henry V. 21. Henry V. Henry V is remembered as the Golden Prince of English chivalry, the warrior king who inspired Shakespearean speeches and national myths. He was the victor of Agincourt, the steel-eyed sovereign who turned a dwindling dynasty into a continental force. But for all the banners and battlefield glory, Henry's body bore the marks of something much more human, visible, lasting injury. Beneath the burnished armor and the regal myth was a man physically shaped, perhaps disfigured, by war. Born in 1386, Henry was thrust into battle before he was old enough to vote in a modern parliament. At just 16, he fought at the Battle of Shrewsbury in 1403, where a rebel arrow struck him in the face. It was a defining moment, not only in his military career, but in the physical shaping of the king he would become. The arrow reportedly lodged beneath his eye and into his skull, narrowly missing his brain. By medieval standards, such a wound was often fatal. But Henry survived. More than that, he endured. The royal surgeons performed what must have been a grueling extraction using a specially designed tool to widen the wound and carefully remove the embedded arrowhead. He recovered, and the legend of the unkillable prince was born. But while the legend marched forward, the scar remained. There is no definitive written description of his facial injury after Shrewsbury, but artists of the time consistently avoided close, detailed depictions of Henry's face. His portraits are stiff, stylized, and unusually lacking in lifelike detail. It's possible that the scar was significant, enough to be carefully omitted from official imagery. For a king building his reign on moral and martial authority, a disfigurement could be a contradiction. After all, a king's face was supposed to reflect divine favor, not the raw violence of rebellion. What's more telling is how that injury came to symbolize something else entirely. Rather than hide the wound, Henry, intentionally or not, let it serve as proof of grit. The young prince who bled for his kingdom, the warrior sovereign who wore his history, quite literally, on his face. It became part of the royal aura, though no one could quite agree on what it looked like. Yet even as he conquered France and brought the English monarchy to one of its greatest military peaks, his health was never robust. In the final years of his life, Henry suffered recurring illnesses, perhaps dysentery or other chronic infections common among soldiers and kings alike. At just 35, he died abruptly during a campaign in France, leaving behind a newborn son and an empire glued together with exhaustion and borrowed triumph. His death was a rupture. England lost a king who embodied strength, but whose body had been cracking for years. He ruled not in spite of his injuries, but through them. turning pain into power, wound into symbol. But when the pain couldn't be masked or mythologized, the crown moved on. As always, and it would move on to a royal heir who never quite ruled, but whose lifelong illness hinted at something deeper, hereditary and quietly ruinous. Edward, the Black Prince. 22. Edward, the Black Prince. Edward of Woodstock, better known as the Black Prince, never sat on the English throne, but he cast a long and ghostly shadow over it. As the eldest son of Edward III and heir apparent to the English crown, he was born in 1330 with every imaginable advantage: royal blood, military genius, and the kind of battlefield charisma that filled chroniclers' scrolls with awe. His victories at Crécy and Poitiers became the stuff of national legend. Yet behind the armor, beneath the titles, was a man quietly succumbing to a slow and relentless illness that would define and ultimately limit his legacy. In his youth, Edward was a picture of strength. Tall, energetic, and a ferocious presence in combat, he embodied the medieval ideal of kingship long before ever donning a crown. He was the warrior prince, chivalric and deadly, cutting a path through France with almost mythic efficiency. But by his mid-30s, the momentum changed. He began to weaken, not dramatically, not all at once, but in troubling increments. Accounts from his later years describe him as pale, frequently exhausted, and increasingly unable to perform the basic duties of leadership. He began withdrawing from court life, delegating responsibilities, and limiting appearances. Battles that once seemed routine now proved overwhelming. By 1371, he relinquished his post as Prince of Aquitaine and returned to England, ill and diminished. The nature of his illness remains one of royal history's quieter mysteries. Some historians suggest tuberculosis, others chronic dysentery contracted during military campaigns. A few propose a form of nephritis, or even complications from malaria. Whatever the cause, the symptoms were consistent: debilitating fatigue, weight loss, and progressive physical decline. His once commanding presence on horseback was replaced by long absences from public view, often punctuated by solemn ceremonies in which he looked visibly frail, and still his image endured. Portraits, tomb effigies, and heraldic symbols all maintained the myth of the Black Prince, invincible, undefeated, untouched. But the man beneath the heraldry was fading. When he died in 1376 at the age of 45, a full year before his father, it wasn't on a battlefield, but in relative obscurity, carried off by a slow-burning illness that sapped the strength of England's greatest not-quite king. His death left a void, politically, militarily, and symbolically. His son, the future Richard II, would inherit a crown weighed down by the expectations of a father who had never failed in war, but had been quietly conquered by his own body. And therein lies the contradiction. Edward was celebrated as the ultimate royal warrior, but he died inch by inch, not by sword, but by something the medieval court could neither name nor control. An invisible affliction, slowly unraveling a legacy made of steel and ceremony. That same affliction, or one eerily like it, would re-emerge in royal blood centuries later, passed not through military conquest, but through fragile genetics. The name would be different, the diagnosis whispered, but the silence around it would be just as heavy. It would surface in another prince almost 600 years later, William of Gloucester. 23. Prince William of Gloucester. To the casual observer, Prince William of Gloucester seemed like the future of a modern monarchy, athletic, well-educated, adventurous, and effortlessly charming. Born in 1941, he was a grandson of George V and first cousin to Queen Elizabeth II. He flew planes, climbed mountains, worked in foreign service, and spoke fluent Japanese. Photographs show a tall, tanned aristocrat with the smile of a man destined to appear on glossy magazine covers. But behind that carefully maintained image William lived with a diagnosis quietly shared by several members of his bloodline. A royal inheritance too inconvenient to spotlight. Porphyria. He was diagnosed with the condition in 1968 at the age of 27, while serving as a diplomat in Tokyo. Porphyria, a rare and complex group of metabolic disorders, can cause a wide range of symptoms: abdominal pain, neurological issues, photosensitivity, and, in some types, acute psychological episodes. Historically, it's been linked, perhaps too conveniently, with figures like King George III, fueling a centuries-long fascination with madness and monarchy. But for William, the condition wasn't a historical theory. It was a lived reality. At the time, the diagnosis was kept quiet. The royal family, deeply practiced in the art of discretion, offered no public acknowledgement. William continued his official duties and hobbies, his diagnosis folded neatly into the background, never allowed to define him. And that silence was intentional. In the world of royalty, physical or neurological irregularity is often treated not as a medical fact, but as a potential scandal, a threat to image, and by extension, to legitimacy. William reportedly managed his condition with discipline, but porphyria is unpredictable. It can lie dormant and then erupt without warning. It's unclear how severely it affected him after the diagnosis. But the very fact of its presence within the royal line rekindled old suspicions. Was this the same affliction that haunted George III? Was the disorder hereditary? Was it still quietly shaping the private lives of royals, even as their public image grew ever more polished? Tragically, William's life was cut short before those questions could gather momentum. In 1972, just 4 years after his diagnosis, he died in a plane crash during an amateur air race. He was 30 years old. The cause of the crash was ruled pilot error, not a medical episode. But the abruptness of his death allowed the palace, once again, to preserve the mystique. The illness faded from the public record. The focus shifted to the accident, not the underlying condition. And so William became another royal with a silent legacy, promising, photogenic, quietly afflicted. His story sits at the edge of the modern royal narrative, just far enough removed to be unexamined, just close enough to be unsettling. But the deeper irony lies not in his death, but in the pattern he represents. Because porphyria didn't start or end with William. It clung to the royal bloodline like a shadow, uncertain, unconfirmed, but persistent. And if you trace that shadow back a generation, you'll find whispers of the same disorder in a royal woman whose body was caught between continents, empires, and unspoken symptoms. Princess Victoria, Empress Frederick, 24. Princess Victoria, Empress Frederick. Princess Victoria, eldest child of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, was born in 1840 with all the promise of a future empress and all the pressure that came with it. She was intelligent, multilingual, politically astute, and raised from infancy to bridge two great empires, Britain and Prussia. When she married Crown Prince Frederick of Prussia in 1858, she became a symbol of liberal reform, enlightenment, and dynastic diplomacy. But the body she brought into this high-stakes marriage would become a quiet source of speculation, distress, and, eventually, historical mystery. For most of her life, Victoria was praised for her energy and intellect. But scattered throughout her personal letters and biographical accounts are references to peculiar symptoms: periodic weakness, intense abdominal pain, nausea, sensitivity to light, bouts of fatigue, and a sense of psychological strain that would appear and vanish unpredictably. She would describe being tired to the bone, unable to rise for days, her hands trembling, her skin flushed. Doctors offered various explanations: neuralgia, stress, female hysteria, but none with real certainty. In recent decades, some historians have proposed that Victoria may have suffered from porphyria, the same elusive, possibly hereditary disorder suggested in other members of the British royal line, including George III and Prince William of Gloucester. The theory fits, at least partially. Porphyria's symptoms align with many of the mysterious ailments Victoria reported throughout her life. If true, it would add another chapter to the royal family's long, largely unspoken history, with an illness that resists clear diagnosis and convenient narrative. But porphyria, like many royal afflictions, was never openly named during her lifetime. Victorian sensibilities weren't suited to medical transparency, especially when the patient was a woman, a future empress, and the embodiment of political ideals. Instead, her symptoms were reframed as stress from her difficult position in Prussia. She was blamed for being too English, too liberal, too outspoken, too foreign for the rigid Prussian court. Her body, like her politics, was treated as an irritant. As Empress of Germany for just 99 days before her husband Frederick's death, Victoria had little chance to shape imperial policy. Her later years were marked by sorrow, widowed, politically sidelined, and at odds with her increasingly authoritarian son, Wilhelm II. Her health declined steadily. She died in 1901, the same year as her mother, after a long battle with breast cancer. But even then, the long arc of her mysterious earlier symptoms remained unresolved, quietly folded into the broader narrative of royal resilience. Victoria's story is a study in contradictions. A woman of formidable intellect whose body often failed her. A princess raised to unify nations, undone by the divisions within her own household, and perhaps her own blood. That bloodline, of course, didn't purge the mystery. It carried it forward, generation after generation. Sometimes it showed up in swelling joints, sometimes in vanished pregnancies, and sometimes in the strange limp of a queen consort known more for her pearls and portraits than the physical pain she quietly endured. Next, Anne of Denmark, 25. Anne of Denmark. Anne of Denmark, queen consort to James VI and I, was a queen of contradictions. Brought to Britain as part of a diplomatic marriage in 1589, she arrived with Lutheran sensibilities, a flair for courtly drama, and a body that, while often veiled in jewels and silks, seemed constantly at odds with her ceremonial role. Behind the elaborate masks and delicate diplomacy was a woman whose health was quietly, persistently fragile. Historical records describe Anne as suffering from a range of recurrent physical ailments, many of which intensified as she aged. The most frequently mentioned were bouts of gout and what was then called dropsy, a term used to describe swelling caused by fluid retention, likely linked to heart or kidney problems. Letters and court accounts speak of her being carried in a litter between chambers, of long absences from court functions due to what were delicately labeled infirmities, and of extended periods confined to her chambers, away from the noise and performance of monarchy. To a modern reader, this may sound like typical courtly life, but in the tightly controlled image machinery of early modern monarchy, any consistent physical weakness in a queen, especially one not giving birth to healthy heirs with regularity, was a political liability. Queens weren't just wives. They were symbols of continuity, stability, and divine favor. A queen with a limp, a swollen face, or an inability to stand during court ceremony was more than inconvenient. She was out of sync with the illusion. Anne's medical problems worsened in the early 1600s. Court letters report that she suffered from intense pain in her limbs and difficulty walking. Some speculate she may have suffered from a form of rheumatoid arthritis. Others suspect complications from earlier pregnancies. She bore 7 children, with only 3 surviving past infancy. The losses took both an emotional and physical toll. She aged quickly, withdrawing from the court life she had once helped enliven with masks, pageants, and artistic patronage. And yet, Anne was never allowed to be ill in public. Her image, preserved in regal portraits, remained composed and luminous. Her body, twisting, swelling, aching, was hidden behind court formality and artistic flattery. Even in her final years, she insisted on attending major events when she could, carried by attendants, propped into presence. When she died in 1619 at the age of 44, the official statements were brief and unembellished. No dramatic mourning, no royal scandal. Just another royal death in a line already accustomed to politely ignoring the physical truths of its members. But Anne's legacy lingers, not just in portraits or palaces, but in the way her body was treated as a quiet obstacle to narrative. A symbol of power, wrapped in pain, wrapped again in silence. And silence, as always in royal history, is where rumors grow. The next queen on this list, Mary I, known to history as Bloody Mary, left behind no children, but volumes of speculation. Her body, more than her throne, became the central mystery. 26. Mary I of England. Mary the Worcester, daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, has long been remembered for her reign of fire, the burnings, the executions, the fierce return of Catholicism to Protestant England. But beyond the polemics and political legacy lies a far more personal and unsettling mystery: the silent war between her body and her throne. She reigned for just 5 years, but spent her entire life in a struggle against physical discomfort, reproductive uncertainty, and a lingering sense that her body had betrayed her in the most public of ways. Born in 1516, Mary was, for a time, the prized heir of Henry's court. Precociously intelligent and politically aware, she was raised with the full expectations of a dynastic future. But her status shifted rapidly after her mother's marriage was annulled and Anne Boleyn took her place. Mary was declared illegitimate, stripped of her title, and forcibly removed from her household. Though this was a political demotion, it had deep physical consequences. Accounts from her adolescence describe periods of intense illness, headaches, menstrual irregularities, and what we might now call stress-related conditions. Some scholars have speculated that she may have suffered from endometriosis or a hormonal disorder, though the evidence remains circumstantial. But the central mystery of Mary's health unfolded during her reign. In 1554, shortly after marrying Philip II of Spain, Mary announced she was pregnant. Her belly swelled, her period stopped, and preparations began for a royal birth. Nurseries were decorated, midwives appointed, astrologers consulted, but no child came. The symptoms had seemed undeniable. Her condition had been observed by physicians, courtiers, and ambassadors. For months, the nation anticipated an heir who would solidify the Catholic succession. But in the end, it appears to have been either a false pregnancy or a psychosomatic condition, an event that today might be diagnosed as a pseudocyesis. She believed she was pregnant. Her body mimicked the signs, and then, without explanation, it stopped. The same thing reportedly happened again in 1557. Once more, Mary believed herself with child. Once more, no child was born. Whether these episodes were driven by illness, stress, reproductive disorders, or some combination of all three is impossible to say. What is clear is that they devastated her emotionally and politically. Her failure to produce an heir weakened her position, heightened tensions, and fed into the Protestant propaganda that painted her as cursed or unfit. Mary died in 1558, possibly from uterine cancer or a chronic infection, another lingering question historians still debate. She left no child, no legacy of stability, and no clear diagnosis. Just a reign marked by pain and a body remembered more for what it failed to deliver than for what it endured. And with Mary's body came another question, one that would echo in kings who followed her, not just the childless or the cursed, but those whose bodies broke down in quieter ways, those whose bloodlines outlived their bones. The next of these, Charles II, the merry monarch with a not-so-merry medical record. 27. Charles II. Charles II is often remembered as the charming comeback king, a monarch who returned to the throne after a decade of Republican rule, restored the monarchy with flair, and turned his court into a place of revelry, wit, and theatrical intrigue. But beneath the surface of restoration glamour and royal charisma was a body struggling to keep up with the very myth Charles had constructed around himself. A body that, despite its elegance in portraiture and vitality in rumor, was quietly failing. Born in 1630 to Charles I and Henrietta Maria, Charles spent much of his youth in exile, watching his father's execution from afar and navigating the unstable politics of continental courts. By the time he was restored to the throne in 1660, he was 30, tall, athletic, and brimming with the kind of worldly charm the English public hadn't seen in decades. He danced, he raced horses, he joked with courtiers, and he famously had an entourage of mistresses who only bolstered his public image as the pleasure-loving king. But Charles's vitality was more fragile than it appeared. Over the years, there were signs: chronic fatigue, persistent digestive troubles, skin issues, episodes of what physicians vaguely described as distempers. At various points, he complained of debilitating headaches and insomnia. Some accounts suggest he suffered from gout. Others hint at kidney or liver issues, exacerbated by a high-sugar diet and the era's near-medieval approach to health. More speculative is the suggestion, proposed by modern researchers, that Charles may have had a genetic condition. He fathered at least a dozen illegitimate children, but never produced a legitimate heir with his wife, Catherine of Braganza. Fertility, or the lack of it, became a shadow over his legacy. Was it simply chance? Was Catherine infertile? Or did Charles suffer from a hereditary reproductive issue quietly ignored by his court? We'll never know for certain. But the absence of a direct heir added urgency to the succession crisis and shaped the instability that followed his death. By early 1685, Charles's health had clearly worsened. He experienced sudden convulsions, now believed to have been a form of uremia or kidney failure, and collapsed. His death was both rapid and unsettling. As royal doctors descended into chaos, they subjected him to an aggressive cocktail of contemporary medicine: bloodletting, blistering, and enemas. None of it helped. He died at age 54. His final words were reportedly, "I am sorry, gentlemen, for being such a time a-dying." The line is too perfect, too wry, to verify. But it fits. Charles lived as a performance, and even in death, his body was forced to keep up the act. The glamour, the charm, the courtly humor, it all masked a physical decline that the monarchy, as always, preferred not to name. And just like that, the restoration ended not with scandal, but with another royal body quietly failing behind a screen of ceremony. Yet the idea of masking decline would outlive Charles. His brother, James II, would inherit not only the throne but the burden of a body no longer trusted to last or to rule without compromise. 28. James II. James II, younger brother of Charles II and the last Catholic monarch of England, was a king haunted by instability. From the throne he would lose, from the faith that made him dangerous, and perhaps from his own body. Born in 1633 into a royal family on the brink of collapse, James lived through civil war, regicide, exile, restoration, and finally deposition. His life was shaped by turbulence, and his health quietly mirrored it, fragile, obscured, and often overshadowed by the more visible dramas of politics and religion. Unlike his flamboyant older brother, James was never the center of courtly attention. He was more reserved, more devout, and more burdened by the expectations of lineage and legitimacy. But even in his youth, there were signs of physical vulnerability. He suffered from intermittent bouts of illness, episodes often dismissed as fevers or ague, but which returned persistently throughout his life. His skin was pale, his endurance unpredictable, and his ability to appear strong in the performative rituals of kingship often compromised by what sources delicately referred to as spasms or attacks. Later medical interpretations have speculated that James may have struggled with gout, kidney stones, or some form of cardiovascular disease. There were reports of swelling in the legs, difficulty standing for long periods, and unexplained episodes of weakness. His lifestyle, marked by heavy ceremonial obligations and long stretches of sedentary behavior, only exacerbated these issues. And while none of these conditions were dramatic enough to warrant court gossip or exile from public view, they chipped away at his presence over time. But the more intriguing suggestion is the faint echo of a deeper hereditary thread. Porphyria, the elusive disorder that has been tentatively linked to several royal figures before and after James. While there's no concrete evidence tying him to the disease, his reported symptoms, abdominal discomfort, limb pain, skin sensitivity, and erratic mood shifts, align with modern diagnostic criteria in ways that are difficult to ignore. Of course, James's legacy would be shaped far more by his politics than his physical decline. His open Catholicism, his attempts to expand royal authority, and the birth of a male heir in 1688 triggered a full-blown crisis of legitimacy. Protestant nobles feared a Catholic dynasty and invited William of Orange to intervene. James fled, and in doing so was declared to have abdicated the throne. But in truth, he was pushed, by politics, by paranoia, and perhaps by a body that no longer moved with the strength or confidence his title demanded. Exiled to France, James lived out his remaining years in relative obscurity, still a king in name, still claiming divine right, but slowly fading. His physical ailments continued, compounded by stress and the indignities of displacement. He died in 1701, aged 67, outlived by the myths he tried to defend. But James's quiet decline is a reminder that royal downfall is rarely just political. Sometimes it begins in the blood, or the bones, or the veins, unseen, unnamed, and never quite cured. And this silent erosion would find one of its most famous expressions in the mad shadows of his descendant, George III, whose illness would shake the very idea of royal sanity. 29. George III. George III is remembered as the monarch who lost America, the king who went mad, and the sovereign whose illness became more famous than many of his policies. His reign, which began with promise and longevity, spanning from 1760 to 1820, was eventually eclipsed by the slow, bewildering collapse of his mental and physical health. But unlike the hidden infirmities of many royals before him, George's breakdown played out in full public view, forcing the British monarchy to confront something it had long managed through silence: visible, undeniable, incapacitating illness. The earliest signs came quietly: episodes of confusion, sudden mood shifts, rambling speeches, prolonged bouts of insomnia. These symptoms first emerged in the 1780s, decades into his reign, after years of otherwise stable governance. What began as manageable eccentricity quickly spiraled into alarming behavior. He would speak for hours without pause, repeat himself compulsively, and fail to recognize those closest to him. At his worst, he was reportedly restrained, isolated, and treated with 18th-century medical interventions that blurred the line between care and containment. For centuries, historians and medical theorists have debated the cause of his decline. The most enduring theory is porphyria, a rare genetic disorder that affects the nervous system and can cause episodes of confusion, paranoia, and physical pain. It was this hypothesis that allowed biographers to retroactively connect George III to a supposed royal bloodline of hidden illness stretching back generations. Porphyria became the elegant explanation. Not madness, but misdiagnosis. More recently, scholars have questioned that theory, proposing instead that George may have suffered from bipolar disorder or another form of psychiatric illness. His symptoms, they argue, resemble the manic phases of a mood disorder more than the neurological hallmarks of porphyria. But whatever the label, the fact remains. George III's illness couldn't be concealed. Not from his court, not from his people, and certainly not from history. His episodes came and went over decades, each time leaving him more diminished. By 1810, after the death of his beloved daughter, Princess Amelia, his condition worsened irreversibly. Parliament enacted the Regency Act, allowing his son, later George IV, to rule in his place. George III spent the last 10 years of his life blind, deaf, and confined to Windsor Castle, completely removed from public life. He died in 1820, outliving his wife, his heir, and the myth of the infallible monarch. What makes George's decline so historically significant isn't just the scale of it, it's how public it became. For the first time, the British monarchy had to reckon with a king who could not rule because of his mind, not his politics. There was no way to reframe, no way to pose him carefully in oil. His suffering was recorded in state documents, observed by Parliament, and whispered about in streets and salons across Europe. And yet, as always, the silence returned. His heirs rarely spoke of him. His name became a cautionary footnote. But the unease lingered, especially as others in the royal line began to display their own quiet signs of failing health. Like his wife, Queen Charlotte, who died with a different kind of mystery, a slow, quiet fading of a queen consort whose physical decline never made the headlines, but shaped the legacy she left behind. 30. Queen Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. Queen Charlotte, consort to George III, was the quiet half of a royal pairing that became anything but quiet. While her husband's mental illness drew the attention of doctors, courtiers, and Parliament itself, Charlotte endured her own long decline in the background, largely unnoticed, mostly undocumented, and quietly erased in the way royal women so often were. She reigned beside her husband for nearly 6 decades, bore 15 children, and saw her role shift from queen to caretaker to relic. By the time she died in 1818, her body had all but given out, and her public image remained as carefully preserved and concealed as ever. In her youth, Charlotte had been dutiful, proper, and politically cautious. She arrived in Britain in 1761 as a teenager, with little formal education and no real preparation for the scrutiny of the British court. Her marriage to George III was arranged, but surprisingly stable by royal standards. She was pious, loyal, and extraordinarily fertile, attributes that endeared her to courtiers, even as they obscured her personhood. But over time, especially as the pressures of court life, repeated childbirth, and her husband's unraveling mounted, Charlotte's health began to deteriorate. The symptoms were never front-page material. There were no dramatic episodes, no collapses mid-ceremony. Instead, it was the slow accumulation of ailments, chronic fatigue, joint pain, limited mobility, and perhaps even cognitive decline in her later years. Her correspondence in the final decades of her life became shorter, more repetitive, and less involved. Some contemporaries noted a growing forgetfulness, though it was always described with the kind of soft detachment reserved for aging royals. She was fading, delicate, or withdrawn. Historians have speculated about what afflicted her: rheumatism, arthritis, the long-term effects of 15 pregnancies and persistent stress. All plausible, but like so many royal women before her, Charlotte's body was less a subject of inquiry than a piece of court decor, an elegant figure at the edge of paintings and ceremonies, her silence interpreted as grace rather than exhaustion. What's striking is how her decline mirrored her husband's, yet was treated so differently. Where George's madness became a matter of national debate, Charlotte's suffering was private, domestic, even invisible. She became more reclusive, retreating from London to Windsor and eventually to Kew. There, she spent her final years largely confined to her rooms, communicating only with a small circle and rarely appearing in public. When she died in 1818, she was the longest-serving queen consort in British history. Her funeral was dignified, understated, and efficiently forgotten. A queen who had lived through the collapse of empires, revolutions, and a king's mind, and yet left behind so few records of her own body's story. But her silence was not an absence. It was a pattern, a warning. because just a generation later, her granddaughter would inherit not only the throne, but the same quiet frailty. A queen who appeared imperious in paintings, yet limped through corridors in private. The next royal body shaped by pain and hidden from history, Queen Victoria. 31. Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria, the woman who gave her name to an entire era, ruled for more than 6 decades, and yet, much like her grandmother, Queen Charlotte, her body was carefully edited out of the imperial narrative. Her public image was one of steely resolve, upright virtue, and maternal authority. But behind the black gowns, the stately portraits, and the booming declarations of empire was a body worn down by pain, loss, and a life spent balancing on the edge of fragility. Born in 1819, Victoria was small and physically unimposing, but early portraits of her show a vibrant young woman, wide-eyed, energetic, and full of determination. She ascended the throne at just 18 and quickly proved that her will was anything but delicate. Still, her physical health was always under quiet scrutiny. She suffered from recurring bouts of what her physicians called neuralgia and rheumatism, broad 19th century terms for persistent, often unexplained pain in the joints and limbs. Some modern historians suspect that she may have experienced forms of arthritis or chronic venous insufficiency, particularly in her later years. By the time she reached middle age, Victoria was increasingly dependent on walking sticks and later wheelchairs. She reportedly suffered from painful varicose veins and swelling in her legs and feet. Her gait slowed, her posture changed. But you wouldn't know it from official accounts. Public appearances were tightly choreographed. Her speeches were delivered seated or by proxy. Her clothing became more voluminous, both to conform to mourning fashion and to conceal her growing physical limitations. She was a widow for 40 years after Prince Albert's death and spent much of that time in semi-withdrawal, moving between Balmoral, Windsor, and Osborne House. Her letters from this period are peppered with references to fatigue, aching limbs, and difficulty walking. Yet her image as the indomitable matriarch of an expanding empire persisted. Even in advanced age, she was portrayed as a figure of permanence, dignified, unchanging, monumental. But behind closed doors, she moved slowly, painfully, often with assistance. Her final years were marked by a growing physical decline that the royal household took great care not to amplify. Her funeral in 1901 was enormous, befitting the Empress of India. But the body being honored was one that had been quietly failing for decades. The monarchy never spoke of these limitations, not out loud. Victoria's physical frailty was treated the way most royal discomforts were, with soft language, hidden protocols, and a well-timed photograph. But the pain was there, and the silence around it mattered, because her son, Edward VII, would inherit not only her throne, but a body no less affected by illness. His would be a reign of smoke, spectacle, and swelling ankles, masked, again, by ceremony. 32. Edward VII. Edward VII was a monarch built for appearances. Son of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, he spent the vast majority of his life as heir apparent, waiting, watching, and, by many accounts, overindulging. By the time he ascended the throne in 1901 at the age of 59, he was already a public figure of contradictions, a socialite with serious diplomatic instincts, a bon vivant with a bad heart, a king too corpulent for his ceremonial robes but charismatic enough to carry their weight. His health, much like his image, was both managed and misunderstood. On the surface, Edward seemed to enjoy remarkable vitality. He rode, hunted, gambled, smoked, drank, and dined with appetite, befitting the Edwardian age that would bear his name. Portraits and press coverage played into the illusion. Here was a king larger than life, imperial and expansive in every sense. But beneath the gold braid and polished speeches, Edward's body was under siege, quietly, consistently, and inconveniently. From middle age onward, Edward suffered from chronic health problems, that were mostly downplayed by the palace and largely dismissed by the public. Gout was one of the most visible, a hereditary condition exacerbated by his lavish lifestyle. Gout caused swelling in his joints, especially his feet, and made walking difficult. During certain periods, he was known to cancel public engagements due to fatigue or minor indisposition, terms that masked a recurring painful condition which would sometimes leave him unable to stand without support. He was also a lifelong smoker, known to go through at least 20 cigarettes and a dozen cigars a day. Unsurprisingly, this led to persistent bronchial issues. Court physicians noted chronic wheezing and shortness of breath, particularly after exertion or during cold weather. He would sometimes pause between sentences during speeches, not for effect, but because he had to catch his breath. Official statements never acknowledged respiratory illness. The monarchy preferred its ailments veiled in ceremony. By the later years of his reign, Edward's weight became a more obvious issue, both visually and medically. He was obese, and not just by the aesthetic standards of the time. His size contributed to sleep difficulties, reduced mobility, and cardiac strain. Tailors and royal staff had to specially modify uniforms and seating arrangements. During state processions, his discomfort was managed with strategic pauses and the occasional switch from carriage to chair. But again, the illusion was maintained. A heavy king was a strong king, as long as he didn't show the effort behind the weight. What's particularly striking is how the monarchy handled this decline. Edward's image was so tied to strength, virility, and vitality that his health had to be reframed in softer terms. His visible ailments were attributed to exertions of duty. His weight became a consequence of hearty English living. His labored breathing, when noticed, was brushed off as a natural result of age and statesmanship. There was no room in the royal narrative for chronic illness, even when it was in plain sight. Despite all this, Edward maintained an impressively full schedule. He traveled extensively, managed foreign relations with notable success, and played a significant role in shaping the courtly culture of early 20th century Britain. But the performance came at a cost. He ignored medical advice, resisted lifestyle changes, and relied on a close-knit circle of physicians who often acted more like gatekeepers than healers. The palace managed his image with the same rigor it applied to his press releases, meticulous, measured, and steeped in denial. In May 1910, Edward suffered a series of heart attacks. True to form, he refused to stop working. He reportedly collapsed while sitting in a chair, still engaged in diplomatic discussions. A few days later, he died at Buckingham Palace at the age of 68. The cause was listed as heart failure, but the truth was more cumulative. Decades of unmanaged health issues, cloaked in royal spectacle until the very end. What Edward VII left behind was not just a rebranded monarchy, but a refined method of concealing royal illness in plain sight. His reign normalized the practice of looking regal while feeling anything but. It offered the template for the modern royal body, dignified, visible, and meticulously managed from the neck up. But the weight of that template would be inherited. His son, George V, already burdened by chronic bronchitis, would carry it forward. And in the next generation, the image of royal perfection would again be tested, not by obesity or gout, but by a face carefully composed over collapsing lungs, and a voice forced to carry the crown's weight word by brittle word. 33. George IV. George IV was a man whose body never quite lived up to the throne he so desperately wanted. He waited nearly 60 years to become king, longer than any heir in British history at that point. And by the time the crown finally touched his head in 1820, his physical health had all but collapsed under the weight of his own appetites. His reign was marked by grandeur, indulgence, and excess. But behind the glittering facade of palaces and pageantry was a body that had become the monarchy's most closely managed secret. Born in 1762, the eldest son of George III, George was, in his youth, considered handsome, fashionable, and charming. He became Prince of Wales at a young age and quickly embraced the role with theatrical enthusiasm. He dressed extravagantly, amassed a staggering collection of art and architecture, and partied with a zeal that made the Georgian court both envied and ridiculed. But this youthful excess soon turned into chronic overindulgence, and his body began to show the strain. By the time he reached his 40s, George had gained significant weight, more than what could be brushed off as regal fullness. He was clinically obese by modern standards, and his size began interfering with every aspect of his public life. Walking, standing for long periods, even breathing became challenges. His clothing had to be custom-tailored to accommodate his expanding frame, and his physical limitations became impossible to hide. Still, the palace tried. The solution was one of strategic absence and careful stagecraft. George began appearing less frequently in public. When he did, it was often from a seated position or in a carriage, where his figure could be better concealed. Portraits from this period show a man of regal bearing, dressed in military uniform or luxurious robes, but rarely standing without support. The contrast between the public image and private reality was growing sharper by the day. In addition to his weight, George suffered from a host of chronic ailments. He was plagued by gout, which left him with swollen joints and frequent pain, and he developed bladder problems that caused him severe discomfort and required constant medical management. His skin became inflamed, his vision deteriorated, and his general mobility declined so drastically that by the late 1820s he could barely walk. Courtiers described his physical presence as grotesquely swollen and his breath as labored, yet no official statement acknowledged his condition. Instead, updates referred to temporary indispositions, recuperative retreats, and private rest. His diet, rich, constant, and excessive, was legendary. Meals could last hours, consisting of heavy meats, rich sauces, and alcohol in quantities that alarmed even his own doctors. He reportedly drank laudanum, a popular opiate tincture of the time, to dull the pain. His sleep was erratic, and his overall lifestyle, while glamorized by some, was deeply destructive. Yet George IV was not a passive figure in this concealment. He was acutely aware of his appearance and highly sensitive to criticism. He avoided mirrors, refused to be painted realistically, and demanded flattering lighting for his rare public appearances. He clung to the aesthetic of kingship, even as his body made it nearly impossible to perform the role. The monarchy, ever obsessed with symbolic continuity, played along. The irony is profound. George IV, a man who styled himself as the arbiter of taste, elegance, and refinement, ended his life largely confined to Windsor Castle, swollen, breathless, and unable to carry the physical weight of the monarchy he had so long pursued. His courtiers carried him through corridors. Public events were shortened or canceled entirely. The man who once dazzled Europe with fashion now required cushions, footstools, and silence. He died in 1830 at the age of 67, alone and largely unmourned. The official cause was listed as heart failure, but by that point, his heart was the last in a long list of failing organs. The public barely blinked. His reign was short, his health a scandal whispered behind closed doors, his legacy more architectural than political. He left behind Brighton Pavilion and Carlton House, beautiful shells filled with contradiction. And yet, even in decline, George IV cemented something that would echo through the House of Windsor, the idea that the royal body is never just flesh. It is a mirror, a metaphor, a screen onto which a nation projects its myths. His illness, like those before him, wasn't just suffered. It was managed, staged, and then erased. But the cost of that erasure would become more apparent in the generations that followed, especially as the illusion of royal health became harder to maintain. Because while George IV's bulk was carefully draped in robes and marble, the next generation would have to grapple with something far less visible: blood. Specifically, the blood that would not clot, and the royal boy whose every bruise could become a death sentence. That boy was Prince Leopold, Duke of Albany.